and tonight I am reading the Everything You Need to Know About U.S. History book. I know it says you need an ace, U.S. History, but rolling with it. Anyway, so before I said I was going to do just Unit 5, but I was just thinking, well, since Unit 5 is so short, why not add Unit 6 to the mix? Just because why not? So, that's what I decided to do. We are going to be reading Unit 5 and Unit 6 for tonight. It's probably going to be a bit longer, but compared to last night with the reading of The Hobbit, but we're just going to go along with it. So without further ado, let's begin. Unit 5, Civil War and Reconstruction, 1850s to 1870s. As the U.S. approached its 70th year of independence, the relationship between the states and the federal government still wasn't resolved. Slavery remained a contentious issue. How would the North and South reconcile their differences? They couldn't, and the result was the Civil War. Chapter 21, The Sectional Crisis. By the mid-19th century, the U.S. stretched from the East Coast to the West Coast. As states continued to apply for statehood, the debate over abolition went on. The Wilmot Proviso. Representative David Wilmot of Pennsylvania had proposed the Wilmot Proviso, proviso being a part of a law that restricts something, suggesting that slavery be banned in any territory acquired through the Mexican Cession. It passed in the House, but Southerners prevented its passage in the Senate. The election of 1848. When the Wilmot Proviso failed, a new political party formed, the Free Soil Party. They wanted to keep new territories and states free of slavery. They nominated former President Martin Van Buren against the Whig candidate Zachary Taylor and Democrat Lewis Cass, a senator from Michigan. Taylor won the presidential election. The Free Soil candidates won some seats in Congress. Compromise of 1850. When California applied to the Union as a free state, some southern states threatened to succeed. Henry Clay, he proposed the Missouri Compromise too, had a compromise in this situation. California would be admitted as a free state. Texas would give up some of its land, and the government would help pay off its war debts. Popular sovereignty would decide positions on slavery in territories and new states, which meant that settlers would decide the issue. Don't forget, popular sovereignty means authority of the people. Let me, there you go. The slave trade, but not slavery itself, would be banned in Washington, D.C. Congress would pass stronger laws requiring the capture and return of runaway enslaved people. After President Taylor died suddenly and his Vice President Millard Fillmore took his place, the Compromise of 1850 was passed into law. The Fugitive Slave Act. A controversial part of the Compromise of 1850 was the Fugitive Slave Act, which required Northern citizens to cooperate with and assist slave catchers and denied fugitives a fair trial. They were tried in a separate court. It divided the nation even further. The South supported it and felt vindicated. The North hated it. Many free black people fled to Canada, and some northern whites practiced civil disobedience, refusing to follow the new law. The North also passed personal liberty laws. which basically negated the Fugitive Slave Act and proved to the South that the North was not uniformly enforcing the law. In Massachusetts, abolitionist Harriet Beecher Stowe was inspired to write Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel about the harsh realities of slavery. It turned abolition into a topic of household discussion and became one of the most influential books of the 19th century. Yes, indeed. As a matter of fact, I don't know if it'll be discussed in the book later or not, but it has been said that when Harriet Beecher Stowe met a certain future president, based on what time period we're in, you probably know the one, he said, "So you're the little lady who started this war." Yeah, there is something here in the blue alongside what I just read. So, Civil Disobedience was an essay written by Henry David Thoreau, on the idea that people should refuse to follow the laws or commands of a government when they seem unjust. I know what I want to say here, but good lord, this seems very reminiscent of nowadays. I'm sorry to say it. I'm sorry to say it, but it has to be said sometimes. The Kansas-Nebraska Act. In the presidential election of 1852, little-known Democratic candidate Franklin Pierce of New Hampshire defeated the Whig nominee, war hero Winfield Scott. At this time, some western land, including Kansas and Nebraska, was not yet organized into states, and Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas wanted to build a railroad that ran through it from Chicago to the Pacific. He initially proposed making Kansas and Nebraska U.S. territories that, under the terms of the Missouri Compromise, would be free. However, Douglas also knew that Southerners would object to this idea. Backed by President Pierce, he proposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which would invoke the doctrine, a theory or position on an issue, of popular sovereignty and allow the people living in the new states to determine the slavery issue. The act passed, and the Missouri Compromise was made obsolete. Bleeding Kansas. During the March 1855 territorial elections in Kansas, thousands of so-called border ruffians, a tough, lawless person, aka a bully, from the slave state of Missouri crossed the border to vote illegally. In fact, about 4 times more people voted in Kansas than lived there. A pro-slavery local government took control. Anti-slavery settlers started their own government, creating 2 governments for 1 state. In May 1856, the pro-slavery government sent a group to Lawrence, Kansas, to arrest the anti-slavery government. But they had fled. The pro-slavery group ransacked the city in the Sack of Lawrence, sack meaning to pillage and plunder. In response, the passionate abolitionist John Brown led his group in the Pottawatomie Creek massacre of pro-slavery Kansas. Over the summer, hundreds of people were killed in Bleeding, Kansas, before federal troops restored order. Bleeding Sumner. Violence also broke out in Congress after Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts criticized people who were pro-slavery, specifically Andrew Butler of South Carolina. Butler's cousin, Representative Preston Brooks, beat Sumner over the head with a cane in the Senate chambers. Sumner was badly injured. Fun fact, I guess you could say. This was talked about by the YouTube channel Oversimplified with this situation that took place. Northerners did not like it at all, while Southerners sent Preston Brooks canes upon just so many canes for what he did. Interesting, if you ask. I'll be honest, it is an interesting fact, to be honest. But okay, moving on. The Republican Party and the election of 1856. Both the Democratic and Whig parties were splitting along sectional lines. The anti-slavery Whigs decided to join the Northern Democrats and Free Soilers to create the Republican Party. The Republican Party nominated John C. Fremont of California for president, and the Democratic Party nominated James Buchanan, a Pennsylvanian who favored compromise. Before we begin, there are two things here that should mention. First off, though some names have stayed the same, modern political parties are not the same as their roots. And two, Fremont's campaign slogan was Free Soil, Free Men, and Fremont. Pretty catchy if I do say so myself. The Know Nothing Party nominated former President Millard Fillmore. Buchanan won the South and won the election. The Dred Scott Decision. In 1857, a Supreme Court case about an enslaved man named Dred Scott fueled the abolitionist cause. Scott was enslaved by an army doctor in Missouri, John Emerson, who brought him along on travels to Illinois, where slavery was illegal. After Emerson passed away in 1843, Scott petitioned Emerson's widow for his and his family's freedom, but she refused. Scott, his wife Harriet, and his two daughters continued living in slavery. A few years later, with the help of lawyers from the North, Scott sued for his family's freedom, making the argument that they were free after having lived in a free place. After a decade of appeals, the Supreme Court took on the issue in the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford, also called the Dred Scott Decision. They voted 7-2 against Scott. Chief Justice Roger Taney wrote the decision that ruled: 1. Scott didn't have the right to sue because he was legally considered a piece of property, not a citizen. 2. The government can't seize private property, Scott and his family, from a citizen, Emerson, without due process of law. 3. Congress can't ban slavery in the territories because that would violate the property rights of people bringing enslaved people there. 4. Therefore, the Missouri Compromise and other popular sovereignty decisions were unconstitutional. You can very well see how very bad this decision was. And however divided the country was at this point, this decision divided them even a hell of a lot further. The nation's highest court had ruled that black people, whether they were free or enslaved, were not citizens of the United States and did not have a right to protection from the federal government or the court system. Ultimately, the Scott family were freed when Emerson's widow moved to Massachusetts and married an abolitionist, but the damage of the decision had been done. Abolitionists like Frederick Douglass had spoken for years about the slaveocracy, the power of enslavers inside the federal government, and this decision seemed to confirm that the federal government, including President Buchanan, who had pressured several justices in this case, and the Supreme Court were being influenced by Southern plantation owners. In a way, we've had it not exactly like this, but in a way, we also have it this way, considering how goodness knows how many times, with few exceptions, the Supreme Court ruled things along party lines for the most part nowadays. It's gone away to the point to where it's like the Supreme Court, in my honest opinion, has thrown the Constitution out of the window. Like, they will do whatever they feel is right because of what they believe in, instead of what the Constitution states. I mean, we already have that with Donald Trump doing literally the same thing in his own way, but yeah, the Supreme Court definitely was guilty of it. And that's honestly why part of the reason why I read the Constitution of the United States as well as the Declaration of Independence last year. Because I knew about at least some of the presidential powers, but I knew for a fact that presidents do not have any form of um, of immunity in any way, shape, or form. And people seem to be, and for some reason the Supreme Court was okay with that. Which is why I remember jokingly saying, well, that means Joe Biden can fire all the conservative justices and they can't really say a word, especially if he were to rule it as an official act. That was a joke. I wasn't too serious about it because I knew Joe Biden wouldn't have done that. And if he did, I would have been surprised, to be honest. But yeah. Moving on. The Chief Justice believed that his ruling was a compromise that would settle the issue of slavery and its expansion, when in fact it proved to be a turning point in the abolitionist cause, in addition to dividing the Democratic Party. The Lincoln-Douglas debates. In the senatorial election of 1858, prominent Democratic Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois faced a new young challenger, Abraham Lincoln, a Republican lawyer who had served one term in the House of Representatives and 8 years in the state legislature. Since Lincoln was not very well known, he challenged Douglas to a series of debates, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. They met 7 times in cities and towns throughout Illinois to debate what to do about slavery. Douglas was a strong proponent of popular sovereignty, the political position that people living in the state should vote to decide about slavery, believing the voting population of each state should decide whether to allow slavery. Lincoln argued against the expansion of slavery. He centered his campaign on the immorality of slavery and the need to resolve the issue as a nation once and for all. Before the debates, he summarized the problem in his famous House Divided speech. This is known as the Irrepressible Conflict Doctrine. He believed that the nation ultimately would have to decide if slavery was to be allowed everywhere or nowhere. When Douglas accused Lincoln of supporting equality of the races, Lincoln acknowledged that he didn't believe that the races were equal. He said, though, that people of African descent deserved all the rights spelled out in the Declaration of Independence. I wonder how many people knew that and how many people didn't before this moment. Douglas rejected the idea that all states had to hold the same policy. He argued that the Freeport Doctrine proved that territories could exclude slavery despite the Dred Scott decision by refusing to protect the rights of enslavers. He argued that the nation should be a loose collection of states with equal and independent powers, whereas Lincoln wanted a unified nation. The debates attracted local and national attention, deepening the rift in the Democratic Party and boosting Lincoln's reputation. The raid on Harper's Ferry. In 1859, John Brown led another raid, this time in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. The plan was to seize weapons from an armory and use them to arm a group of both white and black abolitionists. That group, who had already been in contact with enslaved people on nearby plantations, would then begin regular nighttime missions to help them escape. I guess you could say this is the precursor to the Underground Railroad. Brown believed that such a constant threat would... Well, actually, did I say that? I think the Underground Railroad happened after this, but either before or after this. If it happened before, this is like the precursor. If it happened after, then it's a bit of a small thing involving, like, a bit of like a side thing along with the Underground Railroad. Brown believed that such a constant threat would convince enslavers that slavery could never be protected and give it up. I'm sorry to say, Mr. Brown, but that was not a good... Like, your heart's in the right place. Like, You're having a certain idea. Your heart's in the right place, trying to free enslaved people. The problem is, part of your logic believed that such a constant threat would convince enslavers that slavery could never be protected and given up. As if we haven't had the moments before this where it has been noted that the South were going to protect their they were going to protect their belief in slavery before this, as if this wasn't the case beforehand. Let's see how it went, though. The raid began on October 16th, 1859. Two tactical errors led to the failure of the mission. 1. Brown's men stopped a passenger train passing through Harper's Ferry. Brown lectured the passengers for more than an hour, then let the train continue on its journey. Once the train arrived in Baltimore, Maryland, the passengers alerted the authorities. In the meantime, Brown waited too long for members of his party to bring reinforcements. Brown and his men were captured on Tuesday, October 18th. You know what? I'm going to be honest. There's a movie. I forget what the name of the movie is. I think it was from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly or something. There's a line that a person speaks after he kills another character. And the line goes, if you want to shoot, shoot, don't talk. In this case, if you're going to raid, do a raid. Don't talk for an hour. Because if you wouldn't have talked, then maybe it may have been at least a little bit different. But instead, you decided to talk for an hour, and that didn't work out for you in this point in time. John Brown wrote about the need to end slavery every day of his trial until he was executed for treason and murder in early December. Rumors spread about Brown and his intentions. Though he was remembered as a mentally ill man intent on creating a slave uprising and making himself a martyr, someone who dies for their beliefs, his stated goal was to free as many enslaved people as he could, and he was willing to put his freedom at stake to do so. Although the raid failed, it inspired Northern abolitionists and frightened the people who profited from enslaving others. The election of 1860. We're now finally to that point. Northern Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas, who supported popular sovereignty. Southern Democrats chose John Breckinridge from Kentucky, who supported slavery. A new party, the Constitutional Union Party, compromise and union at any cost, nominated John Bell of Tennessee. Abraham Lincoln, who believed slavery should be banned in the territories, received the nomination from the Republican Party. Lincoln received only 40% of the popular vote and did not carry a single southern state. However, he swept the North, along with California and Oregon, and became the 16th president of the U.S. Succession. Although at the time Lincoln did not favor abolishing slavery in states where it already existed, he believed that restricting the expansion of slavery would, sooner or later, cause the institution of slavery to fall apart. That idea made the South very worried about having him in the White House. Within days of Lincoln's victory, the South Carolina legislature met for a special session, arguing that if a state could choose to enter a union, it could also choose to leave. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina seceded from the U.S. by repealing its ratification of the Constitution. Some people believed that secession was a state's legal right, and others believed that South Carolina's decision was a revolt. Also, just in case anybody wonders, secede, to formally withdraw from membership in an organization. However, Southern lawmakers claimed that the government had violated its rights by not protecting slavery. The Confederate States of America. Following in South Carolina's footsteps, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, and Georgia also succeeded. On February 4th, 1861, representatives from these states met to establish their own government as the Confederate States of America, the CSA. They elected Jefferson Davis as president. Confederate, part of an alliance or confederacy. Lincoln's first inaugural address. Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4th, 1861. The main points of his first inaugural address were, before we get into that, inaugural, having to do with an inauguration, the ceremony in which someone is sworn into office. Legal redress and revolutionary actions are different. Succession is not an acceptable choice. Redress, relief from an injury or wrongdoing. The Union is perpetual. Therefore, the CSA doesn't actually exist. It is a band of rebels living in the U.S. This is important. Federal property in the South will remain federal property. Slavery shouldn't be completely abolished, but it shouldn't spread. War is not a reasonable option. The people of the United States should all be friends, not enemies, because the United States is one country. The address was meant to reassure Southerners that Lincoln would not interfere with slavery in the states where it already existed. Lincoln's inaugural address is well known for its eloquence. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. I am loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. Chapter 22. The Civil War. Fort Sumter. Soon after his inauguration, President Lincoln learned that supplies for federal troops at Fort Sumter, which was in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, were running out. Sending more supplies could provoke war. After alerting the CSA, Lincoln sent unarmed supply ships. In response, on April 12, 1861, the Confederacy attacked Fort Sumter. The fort surrendered 2 days later. The Civil War, a war within one country rather than between two different nations, had begun. Border states. Lincoln called on state militias to supply troops for what he estimated would be 3 months of fighting. In response, border states North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, and Arkansas succeeded. They refused to bear arms against their fellow Southerners and saw Lincoln's actions as unjust. Border states where slavery was legal, but not such a big part of the economy, Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri, stayed in the Union. In 1863, the part of Virginia loyal to the Union, West Virginia, became the USA's 35th state. North versus South. The North, the Yankees or the Union, who wore blue uniforms, had a bigger population, more transport options, especially railroads, more factories and production capacity, and more money. The South, the rebels or the Confederates who wore gray uniforms, had influence on the world's cotton market. The South needed to fight a defensive war. They hoped for foreign intervention and planned to hold out until the North got weary of the war. The North needed to fight a more active war and subdue the rebels. Both armies consisted mostly of inexperienced volunteers who signed up for only 90 days of fighting. Together, North and South faced the scary reality of a war that pitted countrymen against one another. And so, with everything done here, there is a map I'm about to show you. The states in blue are the Union states. The states in gray are the Confederacy, and area in the areas claimed by the CSA are in purple. This is what it looks like. The First Battle of Bull Run. In July 1861, the Union Army tried to take Richmond, Virginia, which had become the CSA capital. The Confederate troops met the Union Army at Manassas, Virginia, which was a key railroad junction near Bull Run Creek. Neither side was ready. On July 21st, the Union forces crossed the creek and pushed back all of the rebels except for the unit led by General Thomas Jackson, who received the nickname Stonewall for refusing to move. Under Stonewall Jackson, the Confederate Army pushed the Union troops back to Washington, D.C. The First Battle of Bull Run showed both sides that this war was going to be more dangerous and difficult than expected. Rebel Yell. The Confederate Army was known for screaming loudly when they were on the attack, so their battle cry was known as the Rebel Yell. George McClellan and Ulysses S. Grant. Lincoln brought in General George McClellan to lead the Union Army of the Potomac. McClellan trained his troops for almost a year, but convinced that the Confederate troops were too powerful, hesitated to attack. Meanwhile, Union forces in the West, led by Ulysses S. Grant, were taking forts, gaining ground, and seizing control over trade and supply routes. Admiral David Farragut led Navy troops to take New Orleans, wrapping his wooden ships in heavy chains to protect them like ironclads. New military technology. One of the most significant new inventions of the Civil War was the ironclad warship, a ship that was armored with iron. Other major innovations were the repeating rifle, which could fire more than one bullet before it had to be reloaded, and the mini-ball bullet. Soldiers could shoot farther and more accurately. War became a whole lot deadlier. The big battles. The Battle of Shiloh. The Confederacy's western troops retreated to Corinth, Mississippi. Grant's army followed closely behind, stopping near Shiloh Church in Tennessee to wait for reinforcements. On April 6, 1862, Albert Sidney Johnston, leader of the Confederacy's western troops, and his soldiers ambushed Grant's camp. Over 2 days, the Union forces were able to push the Confederates back into Mississippi, but both sides lost huge numbers of soldiers in the Battle of Shiloh. The Peninsula Campaign. Because Lincoln was frustrated with McClellan's hesitations, McClellan finally announced a plan to move the entire army by boat from Alexandria, Virginia to Virginia's Lower Peninsula, a huge and slow operation. But Confederate troops were able to retreat to Richmond faster than the Union Army could cut them off at either Yorktown or West Point. The city had time to prepare. 3 months into the campaign, when Union forces reached Richmond, the Confederates, under the command of a new leader, Robert E. Lee, pushed them back in a major defeat, ending July 1st, 1862. The Second Battle of Bull Run. In August 1862, in the Second Battle of Bull Run, the rebels gained another victory. Apparently it was so uneventful that they just tell us they just tell us which side won that battle. Antietam. Lee decided to attack the North. A victory there would take the war to northern soil. It was also designed to help Virginia farmers harvest their crops by moving the battle north. In September 1862, the Confederate Army crossed the Potomac into Frederick, Maryland, a Union state. Yeah, so also it should be mentioned, these were the battles that were done here, as it shows here where each battle took place. Lee planned to divide his army into 3 units, which made him vulnerable to attack. A Union soldier A Union soldier found a copy of Lee's marching orders in an abandoned rebel camp. When McClellan learned of the plan, he was slow to act when he could have used this secret information to get an advantage. Jeez, McClellan, you are so slow. It's a wonder how you've been uh, in charge of any group of soldiers at this point. It's I mean, maybe Lincoln probably didn't have he probably didn't have very many generals to choose from, but at this point, it's like, dude, really, this is like a facepalm moment because usually when you have enemy plans, you typically would want to come up with a strategy to get the advantage over your opponent, over the enemy. But apparently McClellan's thinking, we'll be fine. We'll just keep on doing what we're doing. 2 days later, on September 17th, the two armies met near Sharpsburg, Maryland, at the Battle of Antietam. Combined casualties were 23,000 killed, wounded, or missing, which became the deadliest one-day battle in all of U.S. history. After Lee retreated, McClellan didn't follow with an attack. Lincoln fired McClellan. Lincoln had enough of his shit. Yes, he did. The Emancipation Proclamation. Emancipation meaning setting free. Lincoln said that the Civil War wasn't being fought to end slavery, but to preserve the Union. He knew that he had to keep the border states under Union control. He was also determined to keep Britain out of the war. The South was hoping that Britain, just desperate for Southern cotton, would officially enter the war on the Confederate side. How ironic! What's ironic here? This book is a what-if story that says, what if England had joined America's Civil War on the side of the Confederacy? We'll get to that book when we get to that book. We got plenty of other books to read before we get to that one. Moving on. Lincoln had a plan for how to keep the border states in and Britain out, but he needed a clear victory before presenting his new policy. This is what he does. If you know the Emancipation Proclamation, you know what it's about. In September, after the win at Antietam, Lincoln announced that on January 1st, 1863, an Emancipation Proclamation order would go into effect. This military order would free all enslaved people in any area that was in rebellion and would go into effect unless those rebellion states gave up the fight before that date. Lincoln timed the proclamation with the victory so that it was seen as an act of strength coming from a victorious army, whereas if he would have lost, it would seem like he was doing this in desperation. He did not have the constitutional power to end slavery, but he did, as commander-in-chief, have the power to confiscate property that aided the enemy. In this case, he used the Southerners' insistence that enslaved people were property against them and declared that all enslaved people in the rebelling states would be free men and women. And this was actually this was a really smart idea a really smart decision from Abraham Lincoln. However, it also could have backfired on him had he lost at Antietam. Because again, since he won it, it was shown as a sign of strength, as a showing of strength. But if he would have lost Antietam, it would have been shown as a sign of desperation from him. That's why it worked so well when it did. This accomplished both of his goals. It kept the institution of slavery intact in the border states while signaling to abolitionists in Britain that the aim of the war was shifting toward emancipation. These abolitionists, who had successfully petitioned to end British land slaving systems in 1833, pressured the British government to stay out of the Civil War. Lincoln and the Union Army had no way to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation, but word spread across the South, and the tide of people walking off of plantations, seeking both freedom and the opportunity to join the Union side, increased dramatically. The reason being is obviously because if they were to arrive in the Union side of the on the Union states, they would be declared free automatically. And so they also joined the war on their side because they basically are fighting for the freedom of their friends and their family and their respective friends and families. That's why that's what they're doing. Black men ready to fight. The Emancipation Proclamation also cleared the way for black troops to serve in the Union Army. From the start of the war, abolitionists like Frederick Douglass had argued that black soldiers could help the North win, as well as prove their worth and earn full citizenship. Lincoln resisted, afraid of how the border states would react. But many black men and women did not wait to be freed. Freedom was theirs if they crossed the Union lines, as I just said. Union camps soon filled with contraband, people who escaped slavery and worked behind the Union lines, supporting the Union cause in many ways. As early as July 1862, black people in New Orleans, Kansas, Missouri, and South Carolina began to form unofficial military units. They were officially brought into the Army in January 1863. The most famous of the black units was the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment. This group of more than 1,000 volunteers came from Canada, the Caribbean, and all parts of the U.S. About 180,000 black men were enrolled in 175 United States Colored Troops USCT regiments by the end of the Civil War. This constituted 10% of the entire Union Army. The home front. Because so many men were away fighting, women in the North and the South took on more responsibility in farming, business, and manufacturing. Women also supported the war effort as nurses. Battlefield nurse Clara Barton later founded the American Red Cross. High demand for supplies bolstered the northern economy. Food shortages and inflation damaged the southern economy and hurt southern morale. Both the Union and Confederate governments imposed an income tax and issued new currency. In the North, this money was called greenback money. The need for soldiers led to the institution of a draft on both sides. Because rich men could buy their way out of it, riots ensued in New York City and more than 100 people died in the July 1863 draft riots. Because, I mean, let's be honest here, the fact that rich men could buy their way out of serving their country was not really well liked. As a matter of fact, I would not be surprised if the people that were going through this, like the negative effects of that happening, probably looked at all the rich men that were doing this and pretty much looked at them as if they were cowards for them not fighting for their country that they claim to love. Goodness knows how many rich men nowadays would probably do that if that was still a thing. Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. After firing McClellan, Lincoln put Ambrose Burnside in charge. The rebels and General Lee formed the Union to retreat in the December 1862 Battle of Fredericksburg. It was one of the worst defeats of the Union Army, who lost more than 12,500 soldiers. Burnside resigned. General Joseph Hooker took his place. In May 1863, Hooker led the Union Army in an attack on Chancellorsville, but once again Lee's army forced them to retreat. It was considered Lee's greatest victory. Hooker was replaced by George Meade. Now it should be noted here, and this does talk about this, but I'm going to describe it in more detail, saying Stonewall Jackson died from battle wounds during the attack. What happened was, in the middle of the night, Jackson was returning, to a Confederate camp. But because the Confederate army that he was, the part of the Confederate army that was there, they could not recognize him. They couldn't see who he was. If I had to guess, they just heard horses galloping, but because they didn't know who it was, their first instinct was to open fire, which, when you think about it in the time of war, makes a lot of sense. But their decision led to the death of Stonewall Jackson. Also here, remember the not-so-great Union generals McClellan, Burnside, and Hooker with this mnemonic device. Make better heroes. That's a burn on all three of them, to be honest. Damn. But now it's time for what would be the biggest battle of the war. Probably, if not the whole war, then it would be the biggest battle up to this point. The Battle of Gettysburg. Lee took another chance on invading the North. In June 1863, Lee's army entered Pennsylvania and searched for supplies in the town of Gettysburg, unaware that Union cavalry was there as well. It was an accidental encounter that blew up into the most famous battle of the Civil War. Timeline. And yes, they do have maps showing these things. So I'll do the days and then I'll show you what the maps looked like to signify what was going on. And there is a P here. But we'll get to that when we get to that. July 1st. After the rebels pushed the outnumbered Union forces back into the town, the Union troops regrouped on Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill, strategic positions on high ground. Both sides called for reinforcements. July 2nd. Lee ordered the Confederate Army to gain the high ground on the hills, Big Round Top and Little Round Top, but the Union held on to these positions after heavy fighting. So for these keys, you have the Union are in blue, the Union Army is in blue, the Confederate Army is in red. Rivers are a blue line, roads are yellow lines, and railroad are lines with think of like so basically a line with like a straight line with some more lines going into it. You know what I'm like. What am I saying this? See like how you got where my fingers at, like right here, like going down and then back up, like so. This was the railroad. That was on July 1st. And here's July 2nd. Yeah, this is I'll show these better detail. July 1st on the top, July 2nd on the bottom. July 3rd. When the Union line appeared to be weakened, Lee ordered General George Pickett to attack the center of the Union line. In Pickett's charge, the Confederates marched directly into heavy Union fire, as shown here, where the arrow is pointing at. July 4th. Lee and his army began to retreat to Virginia. The Battle of Gettysburg was a major victory for the Yankees and a turning point in the Civil War. Pickett's charge became known as the high water mark of the Confederacy because victory would never again be so close for the Confederates. Gettysburg is also famous as the site of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. On November 19, 1863, during the dedication of a soldiers' cemetery there, Lincoln gave a 2-minute-long speech on the importance of the Union's cause. The first line of the Gettysburg Address, 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent, is a clue to the year in which it was delivered. A score is 20, so 87 equals 4 times 20 plus 7 equals 87 years. 1863 minus 87 equals 1776. Vicksburg, Mississippi also fell to the Union on July 4, 1863, which meant that the North controlled the entire Mississippi River. The Virginia Campaign. After all the disappointing Union commanders, in early 1864, Lincoln put Ulysses S. Grant in charge of all military operations so the Union armies could act as one. Grant decided that the war would be an attack on Southern morale and resources. That is, the Union would practice total war. War that also uses / attacks civilians and non-military resources. In the Battle of the Wilderness on May 5th and 6th, 1864, Grant, knowing that his army was larger than Lee's, pushed into Virginia despite heavy losses. From June 9, 1864 to March 25, 1865, Lee was forced to defend Richmond and was vastly outnumbered in the siege of Petersburg. Grant broke through the Confederate lines and forced Lee to abandon his fortifications. Lee's army had dwindled down to just 27,000 men, compared with Grant's forces of 120,000. That's a really big difference. Sherman in the Deep South. In September 1864, General William Tecumseh Sherman marched with Union forces to Atlanta and destroyed the city. He continued on his march to the sea, capturing the city of Savannah, then moving north into the Carolinas. In this terrifying campaign, Sherman's army destroyed plantations and burned fields. He wanted to destroy the economy and the morale of the South. He did, and he stirred up long-lasting resentment. The election of 1864. Until mid-1864, Lincoln had been in a bad position for re-election. After victories in Gettysburg in the South in the summer and fall of 1864, he won in a landslide against George McClellan. It was seen as a command for emancipation. On January 31st, what the heck was I getting 34th from? Congress passed the 13th Amendment banning slavery in the United States, except when used as punishment for someone who is convicted of a crime. It was quickly ratified by the states. The end of the war. On April 2nd, 1865, the government of the CSA fled, burning the city of Richmond behind them so that it wouldn't be of any use to the Union Army. Lee reluctantly decided he had no choice but to surrender. On April 9, 1865, Lee and Grant met at Appomattox Courthouse. Grant offered the following terms of surrender. The Confederate soldiers would be fed and allowed to return home with their property and horses. Lee accepted. The last of the Confederate Army surrendered on May 26th. The Civil War was over with a victory for the Union, and now it was time to rebuild the country. Before we go into the next chapter, it should be duly noted that I would not be surprised I don't know how many people share this sentiment, but from what I've heard, some people, and I apologize for any background noise you may have just heard there as I'm talking, some people believe that because of what was said, let me go back here. Let me see. I'm gonna go back real quick. Because I feel like it was important here. Let me see here. I know I just dropped something there, but okay. What was it that I seen earlier? Yeah, I'm trying to find this thing that I remember reading earlier because I did say it was important. It would be important later. Um, there was something that I said. I'm trying to figure out what I said here. I remember reading something earlier. Trying to find it real quick. Um, yeah, right here. It said the Union is perpetual, therefore the CSA doesn't actually exist. It is a band of rebels living in the U.S. So many people look at that and think that. Let me get my bookmark here. So yeah, talking about how that they were a band of rebels living in the U.S. By all definition, people believe uh, that most, if not all, of the Confederate States of all the citizens of the former Confederate States of America should have been arrested and charged with treason because, in the eyes of so many people, they were traitors to this country because they didn't like the fact that a person that they didn't want to win the election of that year won the election, and so they decided to do what they did. And by definition, that made them traitors. And I mean, I'm not the only one that's called them traitors. I mean, I mean, they are traitors to this country because instead of admitting defeat, they decided, well, we're going to succeed from the Union. We're going to do things our way. And even Abraham Lincoln considered them rebels. Typically, if you consider a group of people rebels, you would call them traitors to the country. So the reason why Abraham Lincoln decided not to do that was because he felt like doing so would have undone what he was wanting to do. He wanted to uh, bring Americans together once again. And he felt like doing so would uh, would lead to another situation happening there. Um, so yeah, whether you agree with what he did in regard to deciding to do what like his post Civil War plans compared to what some people believe he should do, yeah, a two-way street. I noticed I'm a little bit off-center. I just noticed I was off-center the whole time. But anyway, Chapter 23, Reconstruction. Reconstruction was the name of the era after the Civil War ended, lasting from 1865 to 1877. The nation struggled to find a balance between uniting the country and assisting the newly freed black population of the South, who were collectively called freedmen. See that background noise? That was interesting, alright. Anyway, the Freedmen's Bureau. 2 months after the ratification of the 13th Amendment and a month before the war ended, Lincoln and Congress established the Freedmen's Bureau, an agency whose goal was to help the newly freed men by providing education, food, housing, and medical aid. The Bureau was understaffed and lacking funding, but managed to set up schools and universities for formerly enslaved people. The goal of the Bureau was to help the people who have been freed but who had few of the resources they needed to navigate their new lives. Before I continue, there are two things from the first page of the chapter that should be said. The Freedmen's Bureau was under General O. Howard, and Howard University was named in his honor. The 13th Amendment, the first of the Reconstruction Amendments, ended slavery, but had a loophole that allowed prisoners to be used as unpaid labor. Goodness knows, I mean, the Shawshank Redemption showed that. Lincoln's assassination. On April 14, 1865, only a month after the Freedmen's Bureau was established, and just days after Lee and Grant met at Appomattox to negotiate the South's surrender, President Lincoln and his wife attended the play at Ford's Theater in Washington. During the play, Lincoln was shot in the head by Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth and died the following morning. President Lincoln was the first American president to be assassinated, to kill an important person, usually for political reasons. Booth's conspirators attacked the Secretary of State, William Seward, and severely wounded him, and were also supposed to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson. Lincoln's death destroyed any hope for an orderly Reconstruction. Now, Lincoln was reelected, like was said earlier. He was reelected in 1864, and he was really looking forward to having. He spent 4 years dealing with a civil war, and he was looking forward to 4 years of potential peace. Unfortunately, John Wilkes Booth, who, like was said here, was a Southern sympathizer, and he felt he was doing the greater good by assassinating President Lincoln. Lincoln would be, as stated here, would be the first president to be assassinated. I don't know if he was the first president to even have an assassination attempt on him before this, but many presidents after him would be faced with assassination attempts, regardless if they succeeded or not. And as we're going to find out in history, a few people succeeded in assassinating the president. In future years, but we'll get to them when we get to them. Johnson's Reconstruction and Black Codes. Lincoln's vice president, former Democrat Andrew Johnson, was sworn into office. Although Johnson followed Lincoln's agenda for Reconstruction per his presidential duties, he did not believe in racial equality, and his interpretation of Reconstruction was lenient toward the South. Every southern state except Texas created new governments, and Johnson approved them. The new legislatures in southern states passed new laws called Black Codes. Discriminatory, treatment against people based on the group or class to which they belong, such as race. And this will happen many times in this history. We will get to them when we get to them. But know that in my honest opinion, discriminatory acts are bullshit. In my honor, I don't care who it's against. White, black, Asian, Hispanic, Russian, German, I don't give a damn. Anything related to a person's ethnicity, gender, sexual preferences, anything of that is discriminatory and it's bullshit. Anyway, and also they talk about civil rights, I'll do this here too. Civil rights, rights that protect the ability to participate in activities granted to citizens without discrimination, personal liberties. I'll reread that sentence, by the way. Discriminatory laws that denied civil rights to black people and prevented the Freedmen's Bureau from doing its work in those states. Everyone was shocked by Johnson's leniency, even Southerners, who had been prepared to pay a price for the rebellion. Northerners were shocked that the war seemed to have been for nothing. Republicans in Congress refused to let Southern Democrats take their seats the next time Congress came into session. Johnson's inaction drove many to vote for the radical Republicans, who then took control of Reconstruction after winning a veto-proof majority of votes in both houses of Congress in the midterm elections. Radical in this case meaning extreme. Congress gave the Freedmen Bureaus more powers and passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which confirmed that former enslaved people were citizens and overturned the Dred Scott decision of 1857. The 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution was passed in June 1868. It ensured that any person, except indigenous Americans, exclamation mark, born or naturalized in the U.S. was a citizen with full rights such as due process. All of these states had to accept these amendments to re-enter the Union. This led to riots in the South, an influx of black voters, an unsuccessful attempt by Johnson to oppose it. Due process, the normal way that a law is practiced, the process that is due to each citizen. And as much as some people are not going to like me saying this, I have to say it anyway. Yes, that includes illegal immigrants. Radical Reconstruction. In March 1867, Congress passed the Reconstruction Acts, which divided the South into 5 military districts that would be controlled by a military commander until the southern states were readmitted to the Union, as seen here. Impeachment. Aware that Johnson opposed radical Reconstruction, Congress passed the Tenure, term or period in an office or position, of Office Act, which limited executive power by requiring the President to secure congressional approval before he could remove members of his cabinet. During the summer of 1867, when Congress wasn't in session, President Johnson fired his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. Congress voted to impeach Johnson for doing it without their approval and unofficially for disagreeing with Congress. In February 1868, Johnson was tried in the Senate, but he was acquitted by just one vote. He didn't run for re-election. Gee, I wonder why. Probably because he knew that this action, both his action and what happened with Congress, pretty much ruined his chances for re-election. So yeah. So, and this would be the first time, I believe, the first or second time where a president was impeached. But like many cases that we would see later on with other presidents who would be facing impeachment, they would be ultimately acquitted by at least one vote. And it should be noted, and I love this quote by someone. I forget who said it, but somebody says the definition of impeachment, like what would be an impeachable offense, is changed depending on which party is in power. That is very true. And to a degree, there are certain things that a president being impeached for makes sense. Because there are things that a president should do and the things presidents shouldn't do. We go as small as one president doing something that may be considered small, but it's still something that a president shouldn't do if he wants people to look up to him as a leader, to much bigger things. And this was a pretty big deal back in the day, and would still be one in any way, shape, or form, regardless of who was doing it, Democrat or Republican or any of the other parties. Speaking of Johnson not running for re-election, the election of 1868. In the presidential election of 1868, the Democratic former governor of New York, Horatio Seymour, ran against Republican war hero Ulysses S. Grant. Having garnered the support of Republicans in the North and newly enfranchised, to set free or endow with the franchise, such as the right to vote, black Americans in the South, Grant won the election. Hold on a second. Alright, family member, a young family member. My niece wanted to show me her drawings that she made, and they were pretty good. I honestly think they were really good. There's a book I'm thinking of now because she is the drawer of the family. She's the artiste of the family. And I think it's going to be really nice. I honestly think we might have a future animator in the family if she were to decide to pursue that. If she can draw that good at her age, I think she could do pretty good when it comes to animation. Hmm. Back to our history lesson, though. Having having garnered the support of Republicans in the North and newly enfranchised black Americans in the South, Grant won the election. Virginia, Mississippi, and Texas were not allowed to participate because they weren't fully reconstructed yet. Because black Americans turned out in high numbers to vote in the presidential election, Republicans feared that southern states would try to limit their voting in future elections. In 1869, Congress proposed the 15th Amendment, which made it illegal to deny citizens the right to vote based on race. The 15th Amendment did not make any qualifications based on gender. That is, women still could not vote. Reconstruction proves revolutionary. The purpose of radical Reconstruction and the Reconstruction Amendments was to revolutionize the South. Fundamental changes like the opportunity to learn to read and write and the ability to keep your family together were powerful and life-changing. Before his death, Lincoln had sent a delegation to Charleston, South Carolina, to ask a group of black leaders there what kind of support they wanted and needed. They told him the newly freed people needed rights, protection of those rights, and to be left alone. They only wanted land on loan until they were able to pay for it. The 13th Amendment freed enslaved people. The 14th Amendment gave them the full rights of citizenship, and the federal military presence served to protect those rights. Though they did not specifically ask for the vote, men of African descent enthusiastically took up the work of writing new state constitutions, running for office, and voting even before the 15th Amendment made their right to do so federal law. More than 1,500 black men were elected to local and state offices, and close to 200 held federal positions. In 1870, Hiram Revels became the first black American in the U.S. Senate, representing Mississippi. In 1875, Blanche K. Bruce, also from Mississippi, became the second black senator. Life for formerly enslaved people. Most formerly enslaved people were living below the poverty threshold. General Sherman had proposed a plan to divide plantations among freedmen, so everyone would literally get 40 acres and a mule, but this was opposed by Congress. Landowners needed laborers to harvest cotton. The U.S. economy depended on it, and lawmakers feared that if newly freed people had land of their own, they would be unwilling to work in the cotton fields. Most newly freed people were denied access to land of their own, and many resorted to either contract work on plantations or the sharecropping system, a system whereby farmers receive supplies and land in exchange for providing a share of the crop to the landowner, which often forced them into a lifetime of debt to landowners. The Ku Klux Klan. In 1866, a secret organization called the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, was organized in Tennessee with the purpose of violently opposing civil rights for black Americans and terrorizing and intimidating black communities. Wearing disguises and hiding their faces because they are apparently ballless, gutless, racist bastards and, well, just racist assholes, wearing disguises and hiding their faces, members attacked black people, often targeting successful black men in a community, business owners, elected officials, and those who exercise their right to vote. The KKK often lynched their victims. If the local authorities weren't in the KKK themselves, and they frequently were, they often ignored the KKK's activities. Lynch, to execute someone usually by hanging without a trial. Congress investigated the increasing violence against black people and passed the Force Acts in response. These acts, signed by President Grant, allowed the military to enforce the 14th Amendment and protect black people. The acts curbed KKK activity, but the KKK resurged in the 1920s and still recruit members today. Carpetbaggers and scalawags. Northerners who came to work in the South as reformers were known as carpetbaggers, after the luggage made of carpet that they used. Carpetbaggers were accused of trying to make a profit from Reconstruction. Southerners who supported the government were known as scalawags, or rascals. They were seen as traitors to the South. The Panic of 1873. In September 1873, a Philadelphia financial firm called J. Cook and Company went bankrupt, setting off the Panic of 1873. A major economic depression followed. Republicans were blamed. The Compromise of 1877. In the election of 1876, the Republican Party ran Rutherford B. Hayes, the moderate governor of Ohio, against Democrat Samuel Tilden, who fought corruption as governor of New York. Although it appeared that Tilden had won, the Republicans disputed electoral votes from their newly reconstructed states. Congress appointed a commission that led to the Compromise of 1877. Hayes would become president, but in return, federal troops would leave the South and provide Southerners with aid for public projects. The Compromise of 1877 essentially ended Reconstruction. Southern Redemption. Southern Democrats retook control of their state governments. Seen as the restorers of the true South, they became known as Redeemers. They aimed to lower taxes, decrease the size of government, and resist racial equality. Southern states instituted poll taxes, requiring people to pay money to vote, and literacy tests, requiring a certain level of illiteracy to vote. These measures targeted millions. Also redeemers. Redeem, to recover or make amends for. These measures targeted millions of poor and uneducated black men, denying them their legal right to vote and participate in government. Most white men, even the uneducated and those living below the poverty threshold, were exempted from both the tax and the literacy tests by grandfather clauses, that laws that protected men whose fathers or grandfathers voted before the Civil War because they were white. Exempt also means freed from responsibility. Even though these laws were discriminatory and unequally enforced, the federal government allowed them to stand because they were not explicitly based on race. Southern states also passed measures known as Jim Crow laws, which legalized segregation based on race. Again, bullshit. Plessy versus Ferguson. When Homer Plessy rode in a whites-only segregated railroad car and was arrested, he sued the railroad company. The Supreme Court ruled in the Plessy versus Ferguson decision that segregation was legal as long as facilities for black people were separate but equal to those for whites. The Civil War was over, but racial equality was still a long way away. Segregation, the enforced separation of people, specifically on the basis of race. Now, again, it's bullshit. Here's basically what would happen. We're going to get more into this probably in the next unit, and I know I said I was going to do this, but it is 10 after 3 a.m., and I need to go to bed, so what I'll do is tomorrow I will read Unit 6, Reshaping the Nation, 1850 to 1917. I will read that unit tomorrow to make up for me not able to read it here. And when I say tomorrow, I mean later today. But just in case the book doesn't delve into this, so basically what Plessy versus Ferguson did was, it did the whole separate but equal thing. Pretty much, it would separate things like literally everything. Even water. Basically, if you were a white person, you were able to get the luxury. But if you were a colored person, or non-white, because some say colored, some say non-white, you basically were given the shit end of the stick. There is a book that I have here. I don't know where exactly it is. Oh wait, it's actually it's right here. Let me get this book out real quick. Another book out here. Because it takes place. Sorry, I messed that up. This book right here. Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. I want to show you guys this right here. Alright? Let me there's a part of this book here. Let me show you here. Alright, so, look at that. You notice how the white man had the book, the white person had the book up until it was very poor? That's what Jim Crow pretty much did. It led to people not being able to, it basically made it to where non-white people were basically given the crappy shit. The whites would get the new stuff, but once it was so old and decrepit that it wasn't really worth keeping, they would give it to the black people, to the colored people, which is bullshit, like I said before. Yeah. So, before we end this, because I did say all I needed to say, there are a few things I wanted to show that I got recently. I don't know if I shared them or not, but I'm going to share them anyway, just in case I may not have. Starting from the latest to the most recent, I have 6 books here, one of which I just bought today. Let's see, but here are the books that I got from recently to not so from not so recently to recently. I bought A Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. Basically meaning I may have to watch Game of Thrones after reading that book. Then I have The Never Ending Story by Michael N., which is a really good book. I have read that before. Very good book in my opinion. Then we have 2 books. Now, if you guys remember, I read Heroes Don't Run. Little did I know that this book was part of a series. These are the first 2 books of that trilogy. They had A Boy at War and A Boy No More. Both taking place, the first taking place before and on the day of the Pearl Harbor attack, and the other book taking place after it. Next, which are books that I'm pretty sure I haven't shown you, we have a book that was initially by Michael Crichton before he passed away, and was then continued by James Patterson. Eruption. This I was interested in this because I like reading books by Michael Crichton, and I have some James Patterson books. So in essence, this is my 3rd Michael Crichton book, and goodness knows how many of James Patterson. Yeah. And then finally, we're going with Stephen King here. Bag of Bones. Yeah. I have not read this book at all. I just got it early today, so yeah. That's what we got. I'm actually going to go ahead and put these down here. So, yeah. So that being said, I'm going to go ahead and end the stream there. That's a heck of a thing there for us, isn't it? Yeah. Anyway, so like I said, I'm going to go ahead and end the stream there. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed. Tomorrow night, like I said, I'll be reading the 2nd unit to make up for the fact that I said I was going to do it tonight, but it's already past 3 a.m. I need to go to bed soon. So, yeah. So until then, ladies and gentlemen, thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you guys have a good rest of your day. And until next time, ladies and gentlemen, this is Forrest Walpole, signing off.